Welcome to a video covering my top 20 favorite Star Trek alien species. Now, for this, I was ranking the humanoid Star Trek alien species, so not any of the crazy gaseous clouds or random life forms that are not exactly humanoid. So I just wanted to cover my top 20 favorite reoccurring Star Trek aliens. Now, I say reoccurring because I've only considered the main Star Trek alien species because I didn't want to include like one-off episode aliens, guys that we meet once and never see again. So I wanted to cover aliens that are recurring enough to be of note. We will start from number 20 and go to number 1. Now, keep in mind, this is just my opinion for a variety of reasons, whether that be cultural reasons for these aliens, whether it be characters who are a part of any of these alien species, or simply the visual design of some of these species is enough to make me like some of them over others. At number 20, I have Talaxian. Now, the Talaxians are a species that Neelix is known for being a member of this species. They were from Star Trek Voyager, and Neelix is probably the single most prominent Talaxian in existence. Now, why do I like the Talaxians? The Talaxians are a species that receive a lot of hate online for mainly Neelix, as many people found Neelix to be an annoying character. Now, I'm a person who enjoyed Neelix as a character. I thought he was fun. He was different. Now, are the Talaxians so different in their culture? No. So they're not set apart as many of the other alien species in Star Trek that have characteristics that make them so different from all the others that make them notable. The Talaxians don't really have that, but boy oh boy, are they one of the most visually interesting species in all of Star Trek. The makeup on these guys is absolutely incredible, and the fact that from week to week, Neelix was able to be in costume and look as good as he did, and as interesting as he did. The sheer visual magnitude that the Talaxians bring to the screen in Star Trek means that they at least get a spot on my top 20 list. At 19, I have the Vorta. The Vorta are a very interesting species who I really love. This might be a little low for some people, but I find the Vorta to be really interesting. The Vorta, of course, are the species that are a part of the Dominion, and the most prominent one is Weyoun, a character who I absolutely adore and is probably a top 3 Star Trek villain all time in my opinion. The Vorta are very interesting. They're calculating, they're cold, they have an intimidating presence, they're tactical, they're intelligent, they're conniving. The Vorta are very interesting as well because they utilize cloning as their main method of reproduction. This makes their species really interesting, and visually they have really cool eyes, the ears obviously, and they have a fascination with other cultures that makes them interesting to see on screen. I think mainly I like them because of Jeffrey Combs' performance as Weyoun, a performance in which he steals the show in every single scene he's in. I mean, Jeffrey Combs eats up every scene. He is just absolutely incredible and fascinating to watch. So the Vorta are interesting to me mainly because of Weyoun's impact. At number 18, I have the Trill. The Trill are an interesting species in the fact that they are a symbiotic species. So they are essentially worms that live in the stomachs of a host. And the Trill first appeared in Star Trek The Next Generation, as one of them had a little romance as a one-off with Beverly Crusher. But then in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, we're introduced to Jadzia and later Ezri Dax, who is a main character that runs throughout the entire show's duration. So in Deep Space Nine, we really got more development for the Trill. The Trill are interesting in the fact that the worm that lives in the chest of the host species ends up carrying on the memories of all the previous hosts. So you have the sum total of 6 or 7 lives experience in each Trill. Like, Trills can live for hundreds of years, collecting so much experience. So most Trills that we see are very experienced individuals. Trills are not that visually interesting or unique, as really all they have are the little spots on the hosts, but they are still really cool. At number 17, I have the Romulans. This is probably my hottest take of all, as I know there are many fans of the Romulans for their Roman culture. The Romulans obviously date back to the original series, and then appeared in really every other television series since. With Romulans, I see such great potential, but I also see wasted potential. The Romulans have always been snubbed, I think, as one of the original three biggest races in Star Trek. You had the Klingons, the Romulans, and the Vulcans. Those were the three standouts, I believe, from the original series. The Romulans are interesting because of their reveal that the Federation hasn't seen them, and then they're so close to Vulcans. Visually, I find them to be a bit bland because of that. I find Vulcans to be infinitely more interesting as a culture. The Romulans tend to be more volatile and emotional than their Vulcan cousins, but visually they're quite similar, so they're basically just originally conceived as bad guy Vulcans. Their culture was supposed to feel Roman, and I guess it does in the way that they dress and their architecture and their fashion, and I guess some of their political standings as well. But the Romulans to me are a letdown because they never had their time to shine as the big bads. Klingons dominated Star Trek for decades as the culture that was explored and really had all this lore pumped into their society. They became super interesting. The Romulans never had that. The Romulans never had a movie where they got to be the main villains. They sort of did that with Nemesis, like Romulans are the villains, but instead they focus on a Romulan Picard clone, and not the Romulan Empire as a whole. If Enterprise had ever given us the Romulan Federation War, I think I would have found them way more interesting than I ended up finding them. I just don't think they were fleshed out like they could have been. It was always nice to see a Romulan when they popped up in an episode. It was like, oh look, there's a Romulan. But are they that interesting overall? Not to me. Not to me, and I think it's sad because there's a lot of potential there. At number 16, I have Denobulan. The Denobulan are a species of, polygamists that met humanity really early in, pre-Federation. They appear in the Star Trek Enterprise, which is a prequel show to the original series, and one of the main cast from that show, Dr. Phlox, the doctor aboard the NX-01 Enterprise, happens to be a Denobulan. The Denobulans are a very interesting species. I really like the CGI smile that Phlox puts on display from time to time in the series. I like how all Denobulans are shown to have a fascination and a wonder and a love for other species and their cultures. The Denobulans are primarily interesting and different from other species as they are polygamists. They have multiple spouses. So you end up with these huge families for Denobulans, as demonstrated by when Phlox, one of his many spouses, comes to visit him. We get this sense that Denobulan culture is like just giant families. You end up with these huge extended families due to their culture being that of polygamists. Denobulans are really quite cool visually with the ridges down the side of their head and their colorful eyes. And Dr. Phlox is a really endearing character, so it definitely bumps them up in my list, as I really am a big fan of Dr. Phlox. The Denobulans were certainly a cool addition to the Star Trek universe. At 15, I have Tellerites. Now, the Tellerites featured in the original series and in Star Trek Enterprise, but other than that, they're not really used much elsewhere. However, I think they are visually outstanding. The makeup team did a good job throughout the various eras of Star Trek to portray them in a really cool way. They're essentially sentient pigs, and I really liked seeing them in Star Trek Prodigy. The character in Star Trek Prodigy, who is a Tellerite, is a character that's quite interesting, and the way that we get to see Tellerite culture expanded upon in that show is really, really cool. Tellerites are interesting because they send out sleeper ships to really colonize the galaxy, and it's very cool to see how they do that. Their technology is kind of ancient, and they're like these big scavengers throughout the galaxy. They're also a founding member of the Federation itself. So their interactions early as a species, as a people, with the Andorians, with Archer, are very interesting and cool to see. At number 14, I have the Cation people. The Cation people are only really interesting because of their visual appearance. I think they look absolutely incredible from the original series films, the TMPs. The Cations really don't get expanded much, but I just think visually they're enough to have pretty high up in my list. As a Star Wars Expanded Universe fan, I'm also a huge fan of the Cather species, and the Cations remind me of those Cathers. The Cations are a cool people. The Kzinti are very similar to them, and I am also a big fan of the Kzinti. But the Cations are really cool, and it was really nice to see them pop up here and there. They're also prevalent in the animated series, and we get a character there who is much more fleshed out. than other Cations. So I always thought it was cool to see a Cation pop up here or there. At number 13, I have the Suliban, who are a recurring villain in Star Trek Enterprise. The Suliban are genetically enhanced via technology that they have received from the future. The Suliban are creepy and eerie to look at, and the makeup on them is absolutely incredible. It's really cool that the Suliban are shapeshifters and can really shift their body to fit into places they otherwise wouldn't. They also see at a different level than other species, as they have eyesight that has been enhanced, their skin's been enhanced to become basically chameleons, and all of their other senses are genetically enhanced for the individuals who have gone through that enhancement. So the Suliban end up being a very interesting species that I find really, really cool, and they are definitely a villain that is easy to fear in the Star Trek Enterprise show. At 12, I have Nausicins. The Nausicins are a recurring threat within the Star Trek universe, presented in The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and several other places. The Nausicins are thought of as a very volatile species. You speak about a Nausicin with fear. Lower Decks does a good job of showing this as well. The Nausicins come across as terrifying. They're like big, beefy Klingons. In Star Trek Enterprise, the way they threaten to eat Archer's dog, stuff like that with their early interactions with humanity are so funny to me to get to hear about. So that's why I have them at 12. They're an interesting culture. They're like the scarier Klingons that aren't as prevalent in the universe. I think there's a lot of potential with Nausicins to be fleshed out further. At 11, I have the Gorn. Just seeing the Gorn fight against Kirk in the original series episode, when I saw that, I've just lost my mind thinking how cool it was. I know that it seems corny now, but to a younger Brennan's eyes, when I was seeing the Gorn fight against Captain Kirk, I thought that costume was amazing. I thought it was so super cool. And the Gorn further showing up in Enterprise is really interesting as well. Strange New Worlds has fleshed them out a bit, and I don't really like what they've done fleshing them out in Strange New Worlds, but just the fight with Kirk is absolutely iconic, which cements the Gorn as a staple of Star Trek species that are very interesting. At number 10, I have the Gemhadar. The Gemhadar are the foot soldiers for the Dominion. They're under the Vorta, and they're under the Changelings. The Gemhadar are so cool. The makeup on the Gemhadar is absolutely insane, and the prosthetics behind the Gemhadar is just so incredible that actors are able to still act underneath all that makeup. The Gemhadar are so visually cool. Whenever you have the Gemhadar in an episode, you think, wow, that is a big budget episode. How cool it is to see these Gemhadar. The Gemhadar culture is also interesting. They just live to fight. They live to fight, and most of them live to be only like 10 or 20. They have accelerated aging, which makes them interesting as well, and they have a very limited understanding of other cultures, that there's more to life than fighting, war, and death. They fight for honor as well, but they fight because they've been bred to fight. And they're dependent on a drug called the White, and it's very interesting, the Gemhadar culture, how they need that to survive, how they go crazy without it. There's some episodes in Deep Space Nine that flesh them out even more, where there's certain Gemhadar who want more in life, and those episodes are always interesting to explore. The Gemhadars are the perfect killing machines, and they're very interesting to me as a species. Number 9, I have the bajoran. The bajoran are a really cool species. They are a spiritual species who were introduced in The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. The trauma that the bajorans have from the Kardashian occupation of their planet is a heartbreaking one. The deep resentment they have for their neighbors, the fierce loyalty they have to their planet, their patriotism is incredible to see. Oftentimes, bajorans end up being really tough and scrappy based on just how their planet was occupied, how they went through literal pain and torment. I see a lot of parallels to World War II with the pain that the bajorans had to go through, similar to a lot of the pain that Jews had to go through during World War II, unfortunately. And I see a lot of parallels to them with the bajorans. They're a fiercely religious, fierce species that don't let the misfortunes they've gone through get them down. They're resilient, full of heart, and Major Kira Nerys is a great example of that. Little touches here and there, like their first name goes last, and their family name goes first, is something that's really cool. I love their earrings, I love their fashion, and their nose wrinkles are just enough to make them different enough from humans that they're believable as an alien species. I think bajorans are so super cool. At number 8, I have the zindy. The zindy are, well, several species in one. You have your reptilians, your insects, your arboreals, your underwater, your humanoid, and an extinct species that died out. The zindy are really interesting. They wage war with Earth, as they got information from the future that Earth would end up destroying them in a war, so they strike first, killing so many in a heartbreaking manner. They're featured in Star Trek Enterprise, and they're an interesting villain as we get to learn more and more about each individual subspecies of the zindy. It's really cool that the zindy, despite their visual differences, end up working together. Sometimes they have conflicts between them, but the zindy end up being a really interesting species due to the incredible makeup and even pretty decent CGI used on them. At number 7, I have the Andorians. The Andorians go back to the original series, but it's really Star Trek Enterprise that fleshes them out and makes them interesting. The Andorians are a really cool species, and Jeffrey Combs once again elevates them by playing Shran, a very interesting Andorian. Whenever I see Andorians, I think they're so visually cool with their antenna, their blue skin, and their white hair. It's just a signature of the Andorians. And the Andorians end up being very cool based on their warlike culture, their confrontational attitude, as shown in Star Trek Enterprise. Their rivalry with humanity early on, leading to a reluctant alliance, is really cool to see, and I really like the Andorian culture. At number 6, I have the Borg, one of the greatest villains in Star Trek, and I know the Borg aren't really exactly a species in their own way. I do think they've become a species due to the hive mind with the machines and how they amass other cultures and bring them in. The Borg are terrifying, and they're visually amazing no matter which Star Trek show they appeared in. The Borg Queen is the stuff of nightmares, and the Borg are super interesting, especially in episodes where they end up assimilating people like Picard. At number 5, I have the Changeling. The Changelings are such an interesting species. Well, some of them are jerks. The majority of them are jerks. And the Great Link is such an interesting concept to explore. It's very fascinating the fact that they have this hive mind where they're all basically one entity. The only person not a part of this Great Link is Odo. And Odo is such a fascinating character in his own right. The way that René Auberjois was able to portray him makes him such a lovable character as he's exploring the world of solids. His childlike wonder and innocence makes him a captivating character to witness, and René Auberjois plays him in a way where he still feels alien and different and unique. The rest of the Changelings, while jerks, are a very fascinating villain. I find the Changelings to be easily one of the greatest species in Star Trek, and I love the CGI that portrays their shapeshifting. It might not hold up as well now, but I think it's really great for the time it came out. Number 4, I have the Klingons, everyone's favorite warriors. Michael Dorn's portrayal of Worf and the portrayal of General Martok in Deep Space Nine just make them absolutely legendary. While their visual discrepancies have forced me to make several videos on the channel, as their timeline is a little messy now, thanks in part to New Trek, the Klingons of Star Trek, no matter which era you find them in, end up being such a interesting species. Their culture was so fleshed out in the Next Generation that made them really interesting. They are portrayed as just the scariest people in Star Trek Enterprise before the original series. Their rivalry with Kirk, as shown in the original series in the motion pictures. Their alliance with the Federation, as shown in the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. They are a fascinating people, and I just really love the Klingons. Their culture of bravery, the do's and don'ts of Klingons that Worf reveals to us throughout the Next Generation. Their weaponry is so distinct. They really became their own culture in a Tolkien-like manner, where Tolkien would make elves or orcs seem like real cultures. The Klingons seem like a real culture that exists. The Klingons really feel like a living, breathing culture that exists. And that is why they are so interesting, in addition to being visually cool throughout Star Trek's history. Number 3, I have Kardashians. Visually amazing, cunning, sly and slick, the Kardashians are absolutely amazing. Partly due to amazing performances by several great actors who portrayed Gul Dukat and Garak in Deep Space Nine. While the Kardashians also appeared in great episodes of The Next Generation, such as the one where Picard was captured and tortured by them, the Kardashians end up feeling so reptilian. Their design and their makeup is absolutely incredible, and I love the look of Cardassians, but I love the culture more. It's rigorous. They believe in guilty until proven innocent. Little touches like that make the Cardassians feel like a really alien culture that's so interesting to explore. They're cutthroat, they are dishonorable, they are slippery, and I just love their plots. The Cardassians come across as a really ruthless and interesting species, and sometimes we see the good side of Cardassians, and it's always interesting to see. The Cardassians are an absolute staple of Star Trek species, and I think it would be hard for anyone to tell you they're not in their top 5. Deep Space Nine does an incredible job of building them up. And number 2, I have the Vulcans. Leonard Nimoy made the Vulcans. He portrayed Vulcans better than anyone else, although Tuvok and T'Pol are pretty good. Spock, as a Vulcan, introduced the audience to the idea, for the first time in cinematic history, in film or show history, that an alien protagonist can be interesting. Spock captured the imagination of so many, their fascination with logic, their culture that is devoid of emotions. Exploring Vulcans throughout every era of Star Trek, throughout every facet of Star Trek, is immensely interesting. I absolutely adore the Vulcans. They seem, again, like Klingons, to be a real living culture that you could go out and find, just because of the sheer amount of development that went into them. But at number 1, I have the Ferengi. I don't know how anyone could not put the Ferengi at number 1. Armin Shimmerman is Quark, and so many others that play formidable Ferengis absolutely wins you over to them. Their fascination with acquiring wealth, with opportunity. They're just these lovable little rats. Their diminutive rodent-like appearance, with the comedic big ears, comedic butt-like ridges on their head, sharp teeth that have been filed down, the fact that they're all so short and diminutive, they are visually incredible. While they weren't exactly nailed for their characterization in The Next Generation where they were introduced, Deep Space Nine expanded upon them and made them incredible. Their obsession with latinum, with requiring monetary value. The Ferengi feel real, they feel devious, they feel evil, yet they're so lovable and charming at the same time. There's so many touches that make the Ferengi the most interesting species in Star Trek. The nuance with characters like Quark, or Rom, or Nog, or the Grand Nagus make them such an interesting and nuanced culture. I absolutely adore the Ferengi and think they are undisputably the number 1 species in Star Trek.